Bueno,
Morning.
she was muted.
Today, the Office of the Child Advocate is releasing a report on our findings and recommendations following an investigation into the death of Azella Ortiz and the serious bodily and emotional injury of her siblings, who I will refer to today by the pseudonyms of Luna and Matea. Azella died on October 15th, 2024, due to multiple blunt force injuries. Azella's father, Francisco Ortiz, has been charged with her murder and is currently in jail awaiting trial. Massachusetts Department of Children and Families served this family between 2018 and 2023 for a total of 3 years and 8 months due to supported findings of neglect of Luna, Azella, and Mateo by their parents. At the time of Azella's death, DCF was not involved with the family, having closed the case 1 year earlier. The purpose of our investigation was to determine the factual circumstances regarding DCF's involvement with the family prior to Azella's death, and whether the actions and services provided to the family were adequate, appropriate, and in accordance with agency policies and in compliance with state and federal law. Our goal with any investigation is to identify whether state laws, policies, regulations, training, or delivery of services can be improved to better protect the safety and well-being of children. Luna, Azella, and Mateo remained in their parents' care prior to the death of Azella. Although the ultimate tragic outcome of this case is rare, in other cases, this case is very similar to the majority of DCF cases. At the end of fiscal year 25, 78% of families receiving services to DCF were from intact families. That is to say, families who had an open case with DCF due to malpractice concerns, but were those where the concerns did not rise to the level of the state seeking custody. It is deeply important that children are not removed from their caretakers unless it is necessary to safeguard them from substantial harm. While child safety is paramount, removal from the home can have profound consequences for the child's emotional well-being, family stability, and long-term outcomes. It should be avoided whenever possible. This is my deeply held belief as the Commonwealth's child advocate, but it is also the law. Massachusetts general laws have a high standard for removal, reflecting the Commonwealth's values in situations where the state intervenes with family matters. The goal then must be to ensure that children who come to DCF's attention and who are experiencing maltreatment can stay safely at home. To achieve this, DCF's interventions with families should be child-centered, based on an accurate assessment of risk, time-limited, and serve to support and stabilize a family. That is not what happened in this case. The OCA finds that although DCF made diligent monthly efforts to meet with and engage the children's parents, the agency did not have an accurate or comprehensive understanding of the capacities, dynamics, and the needs of the Romero-Ortiz family. Over the course of DCF's involvement with the families, the risks to the children escalated and their well-being declined. However, the DCF case management team did not reevaluate their approach to determine if a different strategy was required to engage the family and secure the safety of the children. As a result, the children remained chronically neglected in the care of their parents, with profound consequences for their well-being. Ultimately, DCF closed the case when they believed the family had moved out of state. The OCA recognizes that DCF employees have one of the most difficult jobs in the Commonwealth. Our report does not lay blame on any individuals employed by DCF. Our reviews obviously have the benefit of hindsight, and details that appear clear now may not have been as clear at the time decisions were made and actions were taken. The OCA has decided to publicly release this report because it exemplifies concerns about the DCF's risk management and case management practices that we have raised before, both publicly in previously released reports, as well as in our ongoing conversations with DCF through our day-to-day case oversight work. The OCA issues our findings and recommendations today with the hope that they will spur action to improve the way our state serves children who make up the vast majority of DCF's caseload, children living at home. I want to share a little bit about the family's background. This family first became involved with DCF in October of 2018 after the agency received a report alleging neglect due to concerns about the impact of the parents' marijuana usage on Luna's safety and well-being after she was born substance exposed. This first case closed in June of 2019. The family came to the attention of DCF for the second time in September of 2020, this time due to a report alleging neglect of Azella for similar reasons as before. The family was involved with DCF for the next 3 years until the case was closed in October of 2023. During this time, the children experienced neglect in the care of their parents that was chronic and cumulative, including inadequate supervision, parental substance abuse, and failure to obtain pediatric medical care. This resulted in missed healthcare appointments, failure to address developmental delays, poor nutrition, social isolation, and unsafe housing. Between September of 2020 and June of 2023, DCF maintained regular contact with the family. There was no discernible improvement in the family situation, nor any change in the DCF approach to the case. The children remained in the care and custody of their parents the entire time. In July of 2023, DCF received a report alleging neglect of the children. The report alleged significant concerns about the parents' use of substances and its impact on the children, alleging that the parents would pass out and leave the children unattended, soiled in feces and urine for long periods of time. Further concerns were expressed regarding the condition of the home, and the report noted that the parents were in the process of being evicted. In this same period, the parents stopped responding to DCF attempts to meet with them, and DCF did not know the family's whereabouts. Children's mother eventually responded to DCF and reported that the family was staying in New York. For the next several weeks, DCF continued to try to reach the family and conduct a video call with the children, but they were unsuccessful. Ultimately, DCF closed the case in October of 2023 because they believed the family to be living out of state. At this point, the children had not been seen by DCF for 114 days, and not after receiving the concerning July maltreatment report. Information gathered over a year later shows that the families returned to Worcester after staying in New York for only 3 weeks. On October the 15th, 2024, a little over a year later, the children were found by emergency services in the care of Mr. Ortiz in an apartment in Worcester. Azella had experienced significant head trauma and was deceased. Luna and Mateo were found severely malnourished and dehydrated, with numerous bruises, fractures, and in the case of Luna, severe dental decay causing her significant pain. Both children required inpatient hospitalization and significant medical intervention. Our key findings include, while this investigation focuses on Azella and her family, the OCA findings in this case mirror patterns identified in multiple other cases reviewed by the OCA. First, The OCA finds that DCF did not have a strong clinical formulation for this family. Just to say, they did not fully or accurately understand the family dynamics, capacities, and challenges, resulting in ineffective intervention. Although DCF completed a structured decision-making risk assessment tool in accordance with policy, they did not evolve or adjust their case practice when the result of the risk assessment tool showed increased risk to the children. Similarly, they did not use the family assessment and action plan or the required monthly home visit as tools to effectively engage the family in a meaningful way or hold the parents accountable for failing to address the needs of their children. DCF created 6 different action plans and met with the family 36 times in 3 years. The substance of those visits changed very little from one to the next. The DCF case management team asked the same questions and received the same answers. The goals and tasks identified in the first action plan, provided in January of 2021, remained almost identical in all action plans provided thereafter. At the same time, there were clear signs that the children were declining. Most prominently, when DCF closed the case in October of 2023, Luna and Azella, ages 5 and 3 respectively, were each deemed nonverbal. Yet neither of them received an evaluation or any services to address the speech delayed, missing the opportunity to intervene early. Although DCF made referrals to early intervention services, the family did not follow up, and DCF was unsuccessful in getting the family to engage. Despite all of this, DCF did not make any changes to their case practice approach. Second, the OCA finds that DCF does not have a structured quality assurance framework to effectively guide their work with intact families, most of whom come to the attention of DCF due to neglect. DCF does have a highly structured quality assurance framework for overseeing children placed in state custody, with clear policies, resources, standardized monitoring practices, consistent reporting requirements to ensure a child's safety and permanence. These include a mandatory 6-week placement review, foster care reviews every 6 months, and permanency planning conferences, and these are in addition to the mandatory every 6-month review by a judge. No similar framework exists to govern DCF's involvement with intact families, despite the fact that 78% of the families served by DCF are intact families. Guidance and policy is minimal, with almost no mandatory requirements for social workers or required quality assurance processes. This is despite the fact that these cases involve neglect, which makes the majority of these cases and can be particularly challenging to manage. Parents who neglect their children are, by and large, not intentionally harming their children, but sometimes, for a variety of reasons, they do not have the capacity to care for them as the child needs, resulting in neglect that can, in some circumstances, be just as dangerous to the child as physical abuse. We also found that the DCF case closing policy does not provide adequate guidance when a family is missing or unresponsive and there is continued risk of maltreatment to the children involved. This lack of quality assurance framework for intact families creates opportunities for complacency or a siloed assessment of the family. And this can lead to miscalculations of safety and risk and a lack of clear tasks and goals to improve family functioning and safety in a timely manner. I want to share our recommendations coming out of this investigation. Based on these findings, the OCA makes a number of recommendations to DCF, including to revise and update the DCF case closing policy with a particular focus on scenarios where a family has prolonged DCF involvement and/or their whereabouts are unknown, to develop and implement a standalone policy about case consultations with DCF clinical specialists that includes procedures to ensure that the recommendations are addressed and followed appropriately. To strengthen the definition of clinical formulation and policy to ensure that it is child-centered and guides assessment, casework, and decision-making. To conduct a training needs assessment of the DCF workforce to systematically identify skill gaps in these relevant areas. To create and embed an understanding of chronic neglect into DCF case practice. Most importantly, to establish a structured quality assurance framework to guide DCF casework with intact families that is well researched and well resourced and independent of the case management teams that oversee the cases. We recognize that fully implementing the recommendations we are making, particularly the last one, will require a significant investment of resources, and that we are making this recommendation at a time of great budgetary uncertainty. With that in mind, I will close with a history lesson. I have been in this role for 10 years, but I have worked in public service for nearly 50. DCF's budget was significantly cut following the Great Recession. At the same time, the agency's caseload skyrocketed due to the impacts of the opioid crisis. The result was a series of deaths and other tragic incidents that called out for significant reform. Helping rebuild DCF and improve our child protective services systems has been one of the top priorities during my tenure as child advocate. And while I believe considerable progress has been made over the past decade, the report we are releasing today also demonstrates that the work is not complete. Supporting and stabilizing families so that children can safely remain at home is a critical goal, but it requires resources. It requires well-trained and well-supported social workers with reasonable caseloads. It requires well-staffed quality assurance processes. It requires high-quality, well-resourced, community-based services designed to support children and families, mental health and substance use services, parenting supports, as well as economic supports. This is my final press conference as the child advocate. After 10 years in the role, my tenure will be ending shortly. I close by urging the Commonwealth not to repeat the mistakes of the past. I recognize that the upcoming budgets will be difficult, but it will be a terrible mistake to balance the budget on the back of the most vulnerable children and families. Consider seriously the investment that it requires to ensure that our children are safe and have the opportunity to thrive. Our children are worth it. Thank you. I am happy to take questions.
Maria, you referenced, despite all of the issues over the 3+ year period, DCF caseworkers did not update their case practice approach. Are you saying at some point those kids should have been removed from that home?
We believe that the risk factors were such, particularly the medical neglect. We had 2 children who were not obviously speaking. And we believe that additional reviews needed to be undertaken to determine what additional things could have been done to get the parents to comply and make sure that the children were being properly taken care of.
So it sounds like you're not prepared to say that they should have been removed concretely.
It's not up to me. I think the removal is a complicated thing. The Commonwealth requires reasonable efforts, but certainly in this case, I think a consultation with the legal department assessing what they had in the case should have happened, and it did not happen.
Is this a budgetary or management problem?
I think it's a complication around neglect cases. I think that there is, neglect, has to be defined with respect to the individual child. And so we talk, and one of our recommendations really revolves around clinical formulation. And we say that because there needs to be an understanding of the particular needs of the child. So a child with medical concerns, a child with a disability, young children in particular, children under the age of 5, which are where the majority of the deaths occur, both in Massachusetts and nationally. So you need to be able to assess, do the parents have the capacity to support this particular child? And can they provide support for that child if the Commonwealth provides additional supports? So it could be daycare, it could be in-home services. But the underlying question is doing that clinical assessment, right? And if that clinical assessment is not done properly, particularly for intact families, clinical assessments are reviewed by the courts. So if there's a problem, it is likely to come up in the court hearing for cases that are court involved. But in cases that are not court involved, it is entirely dependent on DCF itself, which is why we make 2 critical recommendations. Really upping the understanding of clinical formulation and making sure that those are done more effectively, and the creation of a quality assurance framework that is going to provide a level of oversight that is greater than the current level of oversight. And I think will make sure that a fresh set of eyes is looking at the case.
Are you saying that DCF failed Azella and she should be alive today if not for their actions?
This is a really tough one because the case was closed when DCF thought the family was away. So there was a year in which not only was there the DCF had no knowledge that they were back in Massachusetts, but in that entire year period of time, there were no other additional reports of abuse and neglect, either from members of the community, neighbors. And so there was nothing else that came to the attention in that year after they went to New York. So it's hard to say that that was the direct result when we don't know what happened in that year.
Could you talk about, a lot of this sounds like poor judgment. What are the details of the way DCF handled this is outright disregard or ignorance of established protocols and laws? What, aside from, there's bad judgment and there's just ignoring what they should have been doing. Can you detail kind of which are which?
Some of these events, as we mentioned in the report, occurred during the pandemic, right? So that if someone says, I'm afraid to go out during the pandemic, one would be a little bit sympathetic as we were all dealing with something that was brand new for the rest of us. I think that this was an instance in which the worker went out and tried to maintain good relations with the family. It was a family that was evasive. It took multiple attempts to conduct those monthly visits. And so I'm sure that the concern was we need to be able to continue to see the children. I think that there was a missed opportunity to recognize that when you have 2 children who are nonverbal and the department is making offers of free evaluation services and the parents do not take advantage of that, when they were behind in pediatric visits. But again, pediatrician also, who periodically saw the children as a result of DCF pushing the parents to get the kids up to speed in their required visits, pediatrician never filed 51A in this case.
In terms of, to follow up on that, sounds like you're making a distinction between policy and execution at some points here, but it sounds like both, you're saying there's both a policy issue here and multiple policy systemic issues, but also it does sound like there were actual execution issues because there were policies that weren't followed. I understand it sounds like there was extenuating circumstances, but I'm wondering, obviously you're saying there's not any one person or, any one worker that's at fault here, but I do wonder, whether you feel like there has to be, whether it's DCF or your agency, look to actually find out, because there's people at the end of the day who are performing these functions. And if there were policies in place that weren't followed, I'm wondering if you talk about whether those people need to be looked at in terms of whether they acted appropriately.
I think what we've identified here and what's detailed in the report is the lack of policies, right? So it wasn't that they didn't comply with the policies, is that they were not a sufficient number of policies that would have required an evaluation with legal, a policy that required an evaluation with substance use specialists, a follow-up with the substance use specialist. So in other areas of DCF, there are very detailed policies that says, if this happens, then you must do this. In the area of intact families, we do not have that robust policy. So when you look at these cases, we at the OCA are looking at the system. What can we do to improve the system? And that means changes in law, changes in policy, changes in practice. So what you have here is a very limited practice scenario, which is why our recommendations go to, you need to beef up your policies, case closing policy, policies about how you arrive at clinical formulation. I would venture a guess, and this is part of our recommendation on quality assurance, that someone is going to be looking at this case. This was a case that was 3 years old with no improvement, right? So this would never have happened in a case in which custody was given to the Commonwealth. Someone would have said, well, if there's no improvement, and there are strict timelines when you have a court-involved case. So there were no timelines in here that said, well, what's reasonable for change to happen? So it's the lack of detailed policies and the lack of a quality assurance framework where someone was going to be looking and saying, well, wait a minute, this case has gone on too long with no change. And why is that? And someone looking at the case and saying, we've got to review this case.
So you're saying that this entire series of events, over the course of it, no one actually violated any protocols because the protocols didn't exist?
No, and let me give you an example. The protocol on case closing, right, was followed, right? So, do I think that protocol could be enhanced? Absolutely. But the protocol was followed and the case was closed.
So to talk about the protocol, I'm wondering, since it sounds like the family only moved out of state or quote, air quotes around, moved out of state for 3 weeks. Can you talk about what the protocol is? I mean, are there any requirements that they ensure residency or things like that? Are those the kinds of things that need?
Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Like, is there some way of making sure that you're checking to see where they might have gone? I think in this case, they did follow the protocol when the children were out of state. They obviously did not do it as well as we would have wanted to. They contacted the New York State Protective Service Agency, the CPCS in New York State. New York State standards are very different from Massachusetts standards, and on the basis of information that they provided to New York, it was inadequate to New York to act. Like we say in our report that had they actually shared with New York the results of that last abuse and neglect complaint that was made, that might have changed New York's mind, but they didn't share the full information with New York that they had at the time. But they did follow the policy. They did reach out to New York, and then New York said, we can't take any action on the basis of the allegations you've shared with us.
So the policy changes, I'm wondering if you've seen DCF today has come up with, a statement basically addressing point by point to some degree the 6 main recommendations that you made. I wonder if you can comment on whether you think if those, if that response is adequate and if the, if the reforms that they mentioned were made, do you think that that's adequate here, or do you think that their response so far and what they're thinking of doing is in?
I think that the Office of the Child Advocate will be working with them, just as we did, particularly in implementing the 26 recommendations that we made after the death of David Almond. We worked incredibly closely with the Department of Children and Families. We're actively involved in helping them to improve their policies and practices. And so I do fully expect that we will continue as an agency to work with DCF as they implement these changes. I have no doubts that that will happen.
When you
Have they been
release the
responsive
RP,
enough, do you think, over the years, that obviously their response to what you have said, I mean, are they being responsive enough? Are they taking the responsibility, that you seem to, that you obviously the importance of this?
I want to talk about a response in a different way than this investigation. On a daily basis, if not on a daily basis, certainly several times a week, we receive critical incident reports or receive complaints through our complaint line. We have liaison relationships with DCF, and we do an administrative review of the case. If we have any concerns, they are immediately communicated to DCF. And I am happy to report that we have a wonderful working relationship with DCF. And we have not experienced, other than probably in my first month here 10 years ago, that we cannot work with DCF to address whatever issues the OCA staff identified in their administrative review of the case. This goes on virtually every single day, but certainly several times a week. So the building of those working relationships so that we can call the right person, have them address or answer questions that have come up in our administrative review. We do not close these cases until every issue has been resolved. But this is a routine and part of the core functions of the OCA that I don't think perhaps get the attention, because we do not, in respecting of the privacy of both the people who complain and the cases that come to our attention, we do not make those hundreds of cases every year public. We only make a case public where we believe there are some serious policy issues that we believe, if brought to the public's attention, that we will be getting the support in order to see those changes made.
So you released the Harmony Montgomery report a few years ago. You had outlined concern around parental rights versus the well-being of a child. That is something that's been discussed and talked about a lot on Beacon Hill in the last several years, the push to create a Harmony Commission to study how is the agency weighing best interest of the child versus parental rights. Is this at play here? And is this the year now for lawmakers to finally create that commission, just to at least study this issue?
Yeah, the Harmony case was a little bit more complicated because that decision was not made by DCF. DCF opposed the placement of Harmony with her father. That was a decision that was made by the court to allow the father to have custody. So DCF, throughout that case, did not want Harmony in the custody of her father. And we know what happened as a result of that. I don't see that that's the case here. I think that the challenge, and I've seen this throughout my tenure, is that we do not have, and I mean we, including our advocates, our legal services individuals, I don't think we have a shared understanding of the risk and neglect cases. And I think that this is an issue that we have been speaking to DCF about, which is we really need to agree on how do you evaluate cases where the parents want to do the right thing, whether it's because of substance use disorder or their own trauma, a whole bunch of issues that they are not able to do for their children what they need to do. And because of the damage that happens when a child is removed from their family, and there is severe trauma every time you take the child away, even in cases where that is the right thing to do, that what you want to do is to try to figure out how do we provide the right level of services? How do we engage people so that they can help themselves and ultimately help their children? And I think it's really, neglect is a very hard situation and it changes pretty quickly, right? You can have one good day and a bad day. And in that bad day, if you're not paying attention, something terrible can happen to a child, particularly for children under the age of 5.
Now, people don't trust what they do not understand. If there's no real social justice, there's no real mental health well-being for the family or the people who implement the policy in the system. So what is the measurement and policy to help people overcome their unconscious bias and assumptions about the dynamic of the family from the social worker who has not experienced the culture or lived in the country where those immigrant parents are from? Because again, people don't trust what they do not understand. And the system is implemented by people, by social workers who come to training, maybe not culturally competent enough to understand the dynamic. That's why there's a fracture of the implementation of the policy, even if there's new policy being into place.
I understand, and we are all concerned. Anyone who's working in this field is concerned about what we know that the numbers show around disproportionality. This is an issue that the OCA has spent a lot of effort on. Very early in my tenure, we redesigned all of the public-facing reports in conjunction with DCF in order to provide data so that people could evaluate what DCF was doing. And I take great pride in the redesign of 65 reports so that you can now actually look at real numbers. What we discovered when we looked at those numbers, and this is is that there was disproportionality at the front door, which is when people file allegations of abuse and neglect, they are more likely to be filed against people of color. Now, that is not true with an Asian. The disproportionality is small with Asian. The numbers for Native Americans is so small that you actually can't look at that data. The data, as the case goes through the DCF system, there is no additional disproportionality, with one exception, the amount of time to return African-American children back home. That amount of time is taking several months longer than other cases. So the issue of, are we making decisions not taking into account individuals' ethnic traditions, I think is a challenging one. I think because that there are countries where physical punishment is an accepted part of the practice, but that is not acceptable in the United States of America. And so those are issues that get addressed all the time.
Just like you said, the case was involved for 3 years, but the situation was getting worse.
You have a question?
Yeah, so how can we help the parents being understood accurately and in a way that it's in the same vibes?
We can't go back and look. What we can tell you is what we saw in this case that worked and didn't work. And clearly, there was an inability to convince the family to ensure that the children received proper medical care, were not isolated because they never left the home, apparently. And that when no improvement was made, they were either going to change the engagement approach or they needed to escalate the case and make perhaps different decisions with respect to whether it was still safe for the children to remain at home.
Maria, the DCF is obviously not new at this kind of work. They've been at it for quite some time. And as you said at the beginning of your remarks, you've been raising these issues privately and publicly throughout your term of 10 years. What does it say about the culture of this? I mean, none of this should be new to an agency that for decades has worked with these families. What does it say to you about the culture there, that there aren't protocols to more clearly dictate how these cases proceed?
I think that there's always a huge priority of things that they need to address. That there are things that the federal government wants them to change every year, and those take priority because of the funding situation that's involved. Changing of policy and practice, as I mentioned, the change of even one small thing requires, by law, a negotiation with the union. And then when that is negotiated, then it requires changes to iFamilyNet, which is the case management system. Then you have to have changes in policy and practice. And then you have to go and train 4,300 workers, right? So every change that needs to happen represents a tremendous amount of work. There's a list of things that they're working on. It's not that they're not working every single day to review things. It's not that the management team at DCF is not attempting. But these are really complicated cases. And if they weren't complicated, they wouldn't be brought to the attention of DCF. And there are families with multi-generational trauma, which I think is a great many of the cases that we see at the Office of the Child Advocate. And so, yeah, it's hard work.
You spoke a lot about funding. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, specifically, to be fair to to DCF. I think, you're talking about how really more funding is needed. I wonder if you could be a little more specific about, do you have a sense of how much more funding is needed? And then also, obviously, your goal is to protect children, make sure that's being done. You're talking about policy issues. Those are obviously issues that might require more resources. Wondering if maybe, maybe this is too difficult, but if there's a pie chart of kind of accountability, right? And one of those pegs is funding and the other is just kind of execution or policies, in a case like this, or maybe more broadly overall, kind of what percentage do you attribute to a lot of the overall deficiencies, right? Is it mostly a funding problem? Is it a combination? I'm sure it's probably a combination, but I wonder if you kind of talk a little more specifically about these so that people know, kind of what should be done here at the end of the day from your perspective.
Let me just take training, for example. So every time you take a social worker out of the field, they need to be replaced by someone. So if we decide that at the basis of, we're gonna have all these new policies written, and I have no doubt that they will be written, but then you're gonna need to train everyone. And so having a workforce large enough to handle the caseload, large enough to handle people when they're on vacation or medical leave, or off to required training and giving people an opportunity to get away and get retrained on stuff. That requires probably a lot more staff than they currently have. And staff is, in the end, the most expensive thing. So I think that it would be very helpful, and part of our, I think, the more detailed recommendations that we've made around, we made a recommendation in our report about doing an assessment of DCF training needs, right? Which is, what is it that you as a line social worker feel you could benefit from? Could you benefit from more information on child development, for example, right? Could you benefit more from more capabilities around engaging families of a variety of ethnic persuasions, right? So what is it that you're going to need? And then designing training programs and implementing training programs across 4,300, a workforce of 4,300. Right? That requires a level of effort and planning. So I don't have dollar amounts. What we know is that there are between 35 and 40 people who currently staff the independent review of the court-involved cases called foster care review. Right. This is a project that we spent a lot of time with DCF over 6 years, improving the foster care review process so that mistakes were caught early. And I'm happy to say that that turned out to be a very successful project. We still monitor that project to make sure that those are occurring at the right time. So if you're looking at the difference, it would be, you need to quadruple the size of that staff in order to replicate something similar for the number of cases for intact families.
So in terms of maybe I don't know if there's comparison statistics with our states, but in terms of best standards, I don't know if, in the field, there's any sort of, hey, per child through the system, this state spends this much as opposed to other states. I'm wondering whether, you can maybe provide some sort of analysis of, where's Mass rank on that in terms of how much it's spending. And not, as I know you say you don't have an exact dollar.
Well, I think it's really hard, and this is one of those really challenges that we think there's one system. There are 51 systems of child protective service, and every state sets its own standards within some federal guidelines. So it is virtually impossible, and if you were to look at the federal reports that come out, they're always 2 years behind. The federal government says you can't use this for comparison purposes, although everyone uses them for comparison purposes, because you're comparing apples to oranges. We happen to have a very strict standard for what a mandatory reporter needs to do. We have a much higher standard than most states. So it's really impossible to compare one state with another. And states provide different levels of services. For example, I think there's a tremendous amount of concern that somehow we would take a child away because a family was homeless, right, or poor. I think in other states, that's probably a possibility, but given the level of services that we provide to Massachusetts, so if you show up and you're homeless, we're not going to take your children into custody. We're going to get you a place to live. We're going to put you in a family shelter. So it's apples and orange comparison. So I wish there were ways. We have looked at other states in other areas where we could isolate factors to figure out what's the best practice that we could make recommendations. But it is very hard, particularly in child protective service, because every state designs based on the state standards.
So there's no range where you could say, hey, if we increase the budget by.
I mean, there are ranges in terms of caseload, but it's weighted caseload, right? The number of children in the family, the complexity of the case. And so DCF does have weighted caseloads, and there is an attempt to meet the standard that's been negotiated in collective bargaining.
Have there been any personnel changes in that Worcester office since this happened? I know you're not holding anyone responsible, but is DCF do they make any changes in management? Do they?
That's a
fire
question outside of the scope of the OCA's work.
In the simplest of terms, what letter grade would you give DCF in handling the case involving Azella Ortiz?
That's not what our investigation is about. Our
Can you
investigation,
give out a letter grade?
I would not give a letter
You
grade.
wouldn't say an F?
I would absolutely not judge, because I was not the worker that was in that home.
But it wasn't an
Single
A,
month. There were things that could have been done, but I'm not going to give it a grade letter.
so it's not an F.
No.
What would you say to people who are hearing about this and they're seeing, these kids who are caught by the social safety net. They had hands on that could have helped them, and then they somehow fall through the cracks nonetheless. What do you say to that?
I think that's where the Office of the Child Advocate was established almost 20 years ago in order to look at these systemic things and to make recommendations both to the agency, to the governor, to the secretary, to the legislature, and that's what we have done. We have focused on what is it that needs to be fixed in an effort of ensuring that this does not happen again.
How about a holistic approach, having a culturally competent second opinion with a more experienced social worker or supervisor for the fair hearing or for second opinion to be more in-depth in understanding what the parents' needs are and if they were understood accurately besides mental health concerns in terms of training and in terms of implementation of limited budget policy making. A holistic approach of second opinion.
Sorry, can you restate the question?
I'm sorry, how do we make this case as effectively handled by DCF by having and providing second opinion from a senior associate or senior social worker or supervisor who speak the language the family spoke and come from the same culture the family came from, to interfere in the meeting with the family, which is not just ongoing, same action step, same type of people involved, but having a culturally competent person there to really ensure the understanding is accurate and holistic and accurately reflecting the dynamic of the background, the kids and the families, the parents, where they come from.
I do not believe there was any indication that there was a communication problem with respect to language in this case.
Because you can translate.
Take two more questions, two more
When
questions.
do you think these changes need to take place that you're recommending today? A matter of days, weeks, or years?
I think that we're probably going to be sitting down with DCF and really looking at we're going to have deeper conversations around this. I think the idea of creating a quality assurance framework is going to take some significant planning and will inevitably take a request for resources from the legislature.
Just a procedural question, in terms of this press conference, obviously, and I see this a lot sometimes, but it's a 65-page report. It's released, 3 hours before the press conference. I'm wondering if you will commit to, sitting for interviews in the future in the next couple of days as my colleagues and I digest this, because as I'm sure they'll sympathize, it's very difficult to really read, never mind digest a 65-page report and have time to ask cogent questions in 3 hours.
I think the OCA has always made itself available to answer questions. We are definitely accountable to the public, and so we have no problems. Whether it's going to be me or my successor, I think it's going to be a different question because the process of finding my successor has already been initiated, and so we'll see.
Maria, do you fear that there are other Azella Ortizes that are falling through the cracks right now and could end in what happened to Azella?
I think in any given day, it is impossible to say when you're talking about 30,000 kids in the Commonwealths that are being kept at home, that everything is going on perfectly. I don't think we could ever say that. I think the key here is to make sure that there is a competent staff and that there's competent policies and appropriate policies and supports. And then I think that all state agencies can benefit from serious investments in robust quality assurance systems. Because by having, especially when you have the life of a child, 3 eyes on the child is a really good thing. And so the more people who get an opportunity to look at the case, social work is really a group decision-making skill set. And so I think it's really important to make sure that the people who are making these difficult assessments have all of the tools and the support that they need.
Great, thank you all for your time. We're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Any final words?
Nope.
No.